Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling one of those legal ideas. Everyone thinks they know the whole "a man's home is his castle" thing, but we're going to really dig into the sharp limits of that idea. We are diving deep into self-defense law, specifically the very restricted right to use deadly force to protect your home. We call it the defense of habitation. And our main focus is a truly tragic case from 1974, Law v. State. It's about a man, Mr. Law, who was terrified after a break-in. He ended up shooting and killing a police officer he genuinely thought was a burglar. Just a terrible chain of mistakes. And it forces us to ask, if your fear is real, is that actually enough in the eyes of the law? How far does the castle doctrine really go? When does sheer panic just not meet the legal test?
That really is the core tension. And the law here, it's much, much stricter than most people probably think based on movies or TV. To understand how a court reaches a decision in such a devastating situation, we can't just stick with the general idea of self-defense. Our mission today is to really dissect the legal doctrine element by element. We'll start by defining the core standard. Then we'll use the court's reasoning in Law v. State to stress test every single part of that standard. And finally, we'll pull it all together into a clear framework you can use.
Okay, let's unpack this before we even get to the actual shooting. We need a bit of context. Mr. Law, he was really agitated, right? Just been burglarized. We know he put in double locks, bought a shotgun. So is there even a basic legal right to arm yourself if you genuinely think you might be attacked?
Yes, there generally is. The starting point, you find it in cases like Gunther v. State, basically says that someone who isn't looking for trouble can legally arm themselves if they anticipate a possible violent attack. Mr. Law bought that shotgun, I think it was like $39, specifically for house protection. So legally, just getting the weapon, that was likely permissible preparation. But, and this is key, the right to prepare is very different from the right to actually fire the weapon.
Okay, that makes sense. Preparation versus action. So that leads us to the main event, the core legal standard. What is the fundamental doctrine for when homicide is justified in defending your home?
Well, the standard comes mostly from a case called Crawford v. State, and like I said, it's extremely limited. The legal definition says a lawful occupant, someone legally in the dwelling, can prevent someone from entering, even taking their life, but only if there's an assault and an attempted forcible entry happening under circumstances that would create a reasonable apprehension.
Whoa, hang on. That phrase, reasonable apprehension, that sounds critical. It's not just any fear, is it? It has to be, like, objectively reasonable.
Exactly. It has to create a reasonable apprehension that the person trying to get in intends to commit a specific serious crime. It's a short list of felonies of violence, murder, robbery, burglary, rape, or arson, or, alternatively, inflict injury resulting in loss of life or great bodily harm. And maybe most importantly, the danger that this bad outcome is actually going to happen has to be imminent, like right now.
Wow, that sets an incredibly high bar. So the law isn't just asking if there was danger, it's demanding an objective assessment of that danger in the heat of the moment. What are the specific checklist items, the elements we need to satisfy for this justification to work?
Right. To justify the killing, you essentially have to tick 5 interconnected boxes. These come from common law sources. 1. First, there has to be an assault or an attempted forcible entry actually happening. 2. Second, the circumstances must create that reasonable apprehension of deadly danger or one of those specific forcible felonies. 3. Third, the killing itself has to be necessary to stop that felony from happening. 4. Fourth, all other options, all non-lethal means of stopping the crime must have been tried or unavailable. Exhausted. 5. And 5th, the amount of force used can't be excessive. And this is tested against what a cautious and prudent person would have done.
That's the framework.
Yeah.
Okay, let's apply it to the tragic facts of Law v. State. So first step in our analysis, what are the legally crucial facts?
Okay, facts. Law was newly married, very anxious because his home had just been burglarized. He bought the shotgun we mentioned, installed extra locks, and crucially, he'd apparently said something like he was going to kill the man if anyone tried breaking in again. He also had this broken kitchen door window pane. He'd put a temporary fix in, just using a piece of molding to hold the glass. About a week later, 8 p.m., a neighbor calls the police flickering light, maybe a break-in. So police arrive. They go onto the screened porch. Officer Garrison quietly takes out that temporary molding and glass. Why? To test the lock from the inside, see if the door was actually secured. Law, inside, hears this quiet noise, sees someone trying to get in, and fires the shotgun, hitting Officer Garrison.
That's just awful. And the detail that they were talking about, a little lower than normal. The police were trying to be careful and investigate quietly, and that very quietness contributed to Law's fatal mistake. So what was the core legal issue for the appeal court?
The specific legal question was pretty technical. Was the evidence presented at trial legally sufficient to support his conviction? Specifically, he was challenging the trial court's decision not to accept his defense of habitation argument as a valid justification for the killing.
Got it. And what was the core rule of law the appellate court used to decide if the evidence was sufficient?
They applied that fundamental doctrine we just outlined, the one requiring reasonable apprehension, imminent danger, and necessity. And as we laid out, the elements that really became the focus of their analysis were necessity, which is element 3, exhaustion of other means, element 4, and that objective standard of the cautious and prudent person, element 5. The whole right hinges on real or apparent necessity.
Okay, we have our 5 elements, our checkpoints. Let's dive into the court's actual thinking in Law v. State. Where did Mr. Law's defense first start to fall apart in their view? Let's tackle necessity and exhaustion of other means together, elements 3 and 4.
Right.
So the court found his defense failed here primarily because necessity demands that you exhaust other options first. The evidence showed Law didn't try anything else. He didn't shout a warning, didn't yell who's there, didn't make any noise to scare off a potential intruder or, verify the threat before firing. And the police, remember, were being quiet. The court saw the act of removing the glass not as some violent, immediate assault forcing his hand, but more as an attempt to check the lock, to investigate. Since he didn't try any other means, the court basically said, look, using deadly force wasn't strictly necessary at that exact moment to prevent the crime he thought was happening.
So the castle idea doesn't mean you're exempt from basic steps even when you're scared. You still have to try to de-escalate or at least confirm the threat, if possible, before reaching for lethal force. Okay, let's move to what sounds like the absolute core of the decision. The 5th element, the requirement that the defendant's actions are judged against the standard of a reasonable, prudent, and cautious person. Yes, this was catastrophic for Law's argument. He actually argued quite explicitly that when defending his home, his actions should not be subject to the standards of a reasonable, prudent, and cautious individual. He wanted a subjective standard, his fear should be enough. The court completely rejected that. They cited another case, State v. Sorrentino, and basically reiterated the longstanding rule. Yet not justified in taking a life if a cautious and prudent man under the same circumstances would not believe the danger to have been real. And the court pointed to Law's extreme agitation, that prior threat he made going to kill the man, as evidence suggesting his fear, his apprehension in that specific moment was actually baseless and unreasonable given what was really happening. Quiet police officers investigating, he didn't meet that objective standard.
This detailed breakdown really highlights the tragedy. Mr. Law subjectively believed his life was in danger, but the law applies an objective test to the act itself, not just his internal state. So, after going through all the elements, finding no necessity, and that his actions weren't reasonable by the objective standard, what was the court's final conclusion in Law v. State?
They upheld the conviction, second-degree murder and assault with intent to murder. The bottom line, the final holding, was that yes, there was legally sufficient evidence for the conviction because the right to defend your home, your habitation, it's not absolute. It doesn't give you a license for, as the court put it, promiscuous shooting upon a baseless apprehension by an unreasonable person.
Wow. Promiscuous shooting. Strong words. That outcome really does hinge entirely on necessity and using proportionate, reasonable force. Let's try to make that rule really stick for the listener with a hypothetical. Imagine, okay, an intruder breaks a window in your house, but instead of climbing in, they're just reaching inside to grab, say, an antique family heirloom that's sitting right there on the windowsill. Can you shoot them then? They are breaking in, technically reaching across the threshold. What does necessity require there?
Okay, good hypo. The analysis immediately snaps to 2 things. Verifying the type of threat and necessity. First, is stealing that heirloom a forcible felony like murder, rape, or robbery? Almost certainly not. Simple property theft, even if their arm crosses the line into your house, generally doesn't justify using deadly force. Second, necessity. Remember, you have to exhaust other means. Is the heirloom something you could potentially recover later? Could you scare the thief off just by yelling or turning on lights? If the answer is yes, then killing them isn't necessary. Deadly force under this doctrine is really reserved only for stopping those specific listed forcible felonies or preventing imminent death or great bodily harm to a person, not for protecting property alone.
That clarifies the property crime distinction. Now, Law also tried a different angle, didn't he? Something about the judge's instructions to the jury. A procedural point about the burden of proof. Did that go anywhere?
He did raise that, yeah. He challenged the judge's specific wording about how once an illegal homicide is shown, the law presumes it's second-degree murder, and the burden shifts to the accused to show justification or mitigation. Like you said, a technical legal argument about burden shifting. But the appellate court didn't find it was a reversible error. They basically said, look, maybe the judge's phrasing wasn't perfectly precise in distinguishing the burden of proof from the burden of going forward with evidence, but it wasn't misleading or prejudicial in the end. Crucially, the judge also made it crystal clear to the jury that the state, the prosecution, always had the ultimate absolute burden to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt on all elements. So the conviction stood based on the facts and the lack of justification, not because of this procedural challenge.
Okay, so the substance of the justification failure was the key. This has been a really structured deep dive connecting the legal definitions with how they play out in a terrible real-world situation. To help listeners really lock this in, could you synthesize everything into that diagnostic checklist you mentioned? A step-by-step way to analyze defensive habitation.
Absolutely. This is the framework pulling together all the rules we've discussed. If you're analyzing a potential defensive habitation scenario, here are the steps, the questions you must ask. 1. Identify the trigger. Was there actually an assault or an attempted forcible entry on the dwelling itself? 2. Verify the threat. Was the perceived threat one of those specific forcible felonies, murder, rape, robbery, arson, burglary, or R, a threat of imminent death or great bodily harm? Remember, simple theft usually isn't enough. 3. Test reasonableness. This is the crucial Law v. Sorrentino step. Would a cautious and prudent person in these exact circumstances have believed the danger was real and required deadly force? You have to reject the defendant's purely subjective fear here. It's an objective test. 4. Test necessity. This is the exhaustion step. Did the person try all other reasonable non-lethal options first, like shouting a warning, calling police if possible, retreating within the home? Was the killing truly the only way left to prevent the imminent harm? 5. Check proportionality. Was the deadly force used excessive compared to the nature of the threat? If and only if the answer is yes to all the requirements embedded in those steps, then the homicide might be justifiable under this defense. It's a high bar.
That's an incredibly clear and useful framework. It really drives home the limitations. So the big takeaway seems to be, yes, your home is your castle, but it's a castle with very strict rules of engagement. It's a shield, not a blank check, and it's limited by objective necessity and what a reasonable, prudent person would perceive and do. So I'll leave you, the listener, with this final thought to mull over. We called Law v. State a tragedy of errors the neighbors call, the police's quiet approach at the broken window. When you consider all those compounding factors, does the law's very strict application of that prudent man standard maybe fail to fully capture the unique terror someone might feel inside their home in that moment? Does rigidly applying that objective standard always achieve justice in these chaotic situations? What stands out to you when you think about it?
And that's the value of this kind of deep dive, isn't it? Realizing that even in chaos, especially in chaos involving lethal force, the law demands structured analysis. Understanding that necessity and reasonableness aren't just feelings, they are objective legal tests. That's absolutely critical to grasping the true scope, the power, but also the strict limits of defending your home.